Every year, the average American household spends somewhere between $400 and $800 on water filtration. Pitchers, undersink filters, reverse osmosis systems, subscription cartridges that ship to your door every 3 months whether you need them or not. A Norse sailor crossing the North Atlantic in 1000 CE would look at that bill and genuinely not understand it. Not because he was primitive, because he was carrying something in the hull of his ship that solved the same problem for less than what you spent on coffee this morning. Something that worked for the entire voyage. Something that needed no replacement, no subscription, no outside supply at all. And the reason you have never heard this presented as a serious option is not because it stopped working. There's one specific material the Norse crews used that turned water from a liability into something a crew of 30 men could drink for weeks on an open ocean crossing. Not a filter, not a chemical treatment. One material. The exact decision they made about how to use it is coming up. The water treatment and home filtration industry in the United States generates over $50 billion per year in combined revenue from bottled water, filtration systems, and replacement cartridges, according to figures compiled by the Beverage Marketing Corporation and the Water Quality Association in their 2022 industry reports. That number exists entirely because you replaced something: a filter, a membrane, a cartridge. The economic engine only runs if the solution expires. What Norse crews used did not expire. It cannot be invoiced. It cannot be improved by a newer model. It sits in your water and keeps working because the physics of it has not changed since before anyone alive today was born. So, when a New Jersey doctor named John L. Leal introduced continuous chlorination to the Boonton Reservoir supplying Jersey City in 1908, the event documented by historians Michael McGuire and Mark Edwards as the beginning of modern municipal water treatment, and as that chlorination infrastructure spread across American cities through the 1910s and 1920s, the older method did not disappear because someone ran a test and found it ineffective. Not wrong. Inconvenient. A solution any household can implement for less than $1 cannot generate $50 billion per year. That arithmetic requires no explanation. But here's the part the industry hoped you would never sit down and actually work through. Exactly how the copper mechanism operates, why it worked on a Norse longship in the middle of the Atlantic, and what it cost you to run it at home. That is what comes next. This is not a new idea. The Gokstad ship, excavated in 1880 from a burial mound in Vestfold, Norway, and now held at the Viking Skipshuset, the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, was a working vessel dated to approximately 900 CE. Among the equipment recovered from its hull were copper and bronze cooking vessels, not ceremonial, working equipment for a working ship. The inventory is documented in the museum's own published catalog. The Oseberg ship, excavated in 1904 under the direction of archaeologist Gabriel Gustafsson, and also held at the Viking Skipshuset, recovered copper alloy cauldrons among the ship's stores. These vessels crossed water. They held water. They were the standard equipment of crews who understood, through generations of open sea experience, what kept a person alive and what killed them. At the Coppergate site in York, the excavation that became the foundation of the Jorvik Viking Center, documented by archaeologist Richard Hall and the York Archaeological Trust through systematic excavation between 1976 and 1981, evidence of intensive copper alloy working in the Norse settlement dated to the late 9th century covered an entire street. This was not one craftsman with a hobby. Jorvik. The Viking city, published by the York Archaeological Trust in 1984, based on Hall's excavation reports, describes copper alloy working as one of the primary identified crafts at the site. Copper was not a luxury among Norse communities. It was infrastructure. The reason copper was useful enough to be worth carrying on a transoceanic voyage is something a Swiss botanist named Carl Wilhelm von Nageli documented in 1893 in the Denkschriften der Schweizerischen Naturforschenden Gesellschaft, the published memoirs of the Swiss Natural Sciences Society. Von Nageli found that trace amounts of metal, and copper most powerfully among the metals he tested, were lethal to bacteria, algae, and fungi at concentrations too small to taste and too small to see. The metal slowly poisons everything that tries to grow near it, not through heat, not through chemicals you add, through the slow release of ions that destroy bacterial cell walls at the molecular level. Von Nageli called this the oligodynamic effect. The word comes from the Greek for small force, an invisible force, an ancient one. Norse crews operating the trade routes confirmed archaeologically at Lens aux Meadows in Newfoundland. Excavated by Anne Stein and Helga Ingstad beginning in 1961 and carbon dated to approximately 1000 CE, making it the only confirmed Norse site in North America. Carried water across the open North Atlantic for crossings that took weeks. Every single crew that made that crossing solved the bacteria problem the same way. Without a subscription, without a replacement cartridge, without asking permission from anyone. The average American household today pays between $400 and $800 per year for the same outcome those crews achieved with a piece of copper they never had to replace. The physics has not changed by a single variable since 900 CE, and almost nobody is using it. If this channel is new to you, subscribe and turn on the bell. This is what this channel does. Verified Norse age solutions translated into things you can build today, with sources named so you can check everything yourself. Subscribe. Now back to the copper. You have seen this your whole life and just never connected the dots. Old houses built before the 1950s with original copper plumbing show measurably lower bacterial counts at the tap than equivalent plastic-piped modern builds in independently tested samples. That observation is documented in research by Bill Keevil at the University of Southampton, whose laboratory has published over 2 decades of peer-reviewed work on copper's antimicrobial properties across multiple journals, including applied and environmental microbiology. A clinical trial published in Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology in 2013 by Salgado, Farr, and Calfee found that replacing standard hospital surfaces, bed rails, call buttons, IV poles, tray tables, with copper alloy reduced healthcare-acquired infections by over 40% in a controlled ICU study at 3 major American hospitals. Your grandmother's copper pot was not aesthetic. It was functional in a way that no one in her generation needed a peer-reviewed paper to tell them. The Ayurvedic medical tradition in India, documented in texts including the Ashtanga Hridayam, compiled in the 7th century CE, prescribed storing drinking water overnight in copper vessels as a standard method of purifying it for drinking. They did not have von Nageli's vocabulary for ion release or bacterial cell wall disruption. They had consistent results across centuries of practical observation. The mechanism is identical to what the Gokstad crew relied on every morning at sea. Most people who try to replicate what those crews did get one step wrong. It is the first step, and it separates water that genuinely clears pathogens from water that just spent time near a piece of metal. Here is what you need. I want to be honest with you about every number. A pure copper vessel, a cup, a small pot, or a jug costs between $1 and $4 at most estate sales, thrift stores, or flea markets. If you want the cheapest possible version and cannot find a secondhand copper vessel, a strip of pure copper sheet metal cut to the size of your palm costs approximately 70 cents, available from the plumbing supply aisle of any hardware store. You want pure copper, not copper-coated steel, not copper-plated zinc. Look for the grade designation C110 or C101 on the packaging. That is electrolytic tough-pitch copper, the same alloy specification used in household plumbing pipe. A piece the size of your palm, dropped into any glass jar, creates the same contact surface as a dedicated copper vessel. A clean 1-liter glass jar with a lid costs nothing if you already have one at home. That is genuinely it. Here's the one thing most people get wrong. They put the copper in and drink the water immediately. They treat it the way they treat a filter, as if the copper acts on the water the moment it touches it. A mechanical filter acts immediately. The oligodynamic effect is not mechanical. It is a chemical process, and it operates over time. The Norse crews were not stopping to drink from the copper cauldron the moment water went in. They were storing for the night, for the watch, for the crossing. The copper had hours to work because weeks at sea gave it hours. The research confirms the specific window you need. A study published in the Journal of Health, Population, and Nutrition in 2012, examining microbially contaminated water stored in copper pots versus clay pots as a control, found that water deliberately inoculated with Salmonella typhi, Vibrio cholerae, and Escherichia coli showed complete elimination of all 3 pathogens after 16 hours of storage in copper vessels at room temperature. The clay control pots showed no reduction. The copper pots needed no electricity, no added chemical, and no ongoing cost. 6 hours is the practical minimum for partial effect. Overnight, 8 to 16 hours, is the window for complete pathogen elimination across the tested organisms. Here's how you build this, step by step. First, clean the copper. Not with dish soap. Soap leaves a film on the copper surface that slows the rate at which ions move from the metal into the water. Use white vinegar and salt. A tablespoon of salt stirred into a 1/4 cup of white vinegar makes a mild acid solution that strips the dark oxidation layer off copper in about 60 seconds. Rub the surface with a cloth soaked in the mixture. Rinse with clean water. The surface should look bright orange-pink, not brown and not green. Fresh copper surface releases ions faster than oxidized copper. You want the fresh surface in contact with the water. Second, fill the vessel. Use cold or room temperature water, not hot. This is the measurement that matters. Hot water accelerates copper ion release above the range, where the effect is antimicrobial, into the range, where copper becomes a contaminant in its own right. The United States Environmental Protection Agency sets the copper action level in drinking water at 3 milligrams per liter. The Journal of Health, Population, and Nutrition 2012 study measured copper ion concentration in water stored overnight in copper pots at between 0.17 and 0.47 milligrams per liter. comfortably below the EPA action level, comfortably above zero. Cold water keeps the release rate in that range. Hot water pushes past it. Third, cover the vessel. Leave it in a cool, stable location out of direct sunlight. The chemistry does not need anything from you during this phase. It just needs time. 8 hours minimum for everyday use. Overnight is standard practice. The next step is the one most people skip. It is also the one that separated a Norse crew that stayed healthy on a 6-week crossing from one that started losing sailors to waterborne illness in the 3rd week. Before you drink, pour the first 100 milliliters out. Discard them. This leading portion has been in direct surface contact longest and carries the peak ion concentration for that batch. The bulk of the water that follows sits in the therapeutic middle range. The practice of discarding the first pour from a vessel is documented across enough independent historical cultures that it represents practical observation rather than coincidence. The crews working the Greenland routes described in the Land Namabok, the Book of Settlements, compiled around 1100 CE and preserved in manuscripts now held at the Arni Magnusson Institute in Reykjavik, were not chemists. They were pragmatic enough to observe what kept people alive at sea and repeat it. Drink the rest. The taste is subtly different from chlorinated tap water. Most people describe it as cleaner and flatter. That is not the presence of copper, that is the absence of chlorine. If you notice a distinct metallic flavor, the ion concentration is running too high, which means either the water was too warm or the copper was not clean. Run the vinegar and salt cleaning process again. Dry the copper fully before use. Start the next batch with cooler water. You just built the same water system the Gokstad crew used every day of every crossing they made for less than $1. If you built this, you now understand the basic architecture of something most people in this country have been trained, through decades of infrastructure investment, not to think about. This channel covers the whole pattern. Subscribe if you want to keep building. The next documented technique from the Norse age is already filmed. One vessel solves one household's drinking water problem. What a Norse settlement of 300 people did with the same principle at settlement scale, and what that means for a modern household or community trying to reduce complete dependence on municipal infrastructure, changes how you think about the total cost. The settlement at Hedeby, occupied from approximately 800 to 1050 CE and positioned at the base of the Jutland Peninsula near modern Schleswig in northern Germany, is one of the most extensively excavated Norse urban sites in existence. Excavations beginning in 1900 under Herman Henrik Johansson and continuing through the 20th century, with comprehensive analysis published by the Archaeologisches Landesmuseum Schleswig-Holstein, document Hedeby as a trading town of several thousand people at its peak. Copper alloy craftsmanship at Hedeby is documented on a production scale, not a household scale. Ingots, casting waste, finished vessels, and tool blanks were all recovered. This was an organized material system. A settlement that understood, across generations of trade and ocean travel, that copper paid for itself through what it prevented. A household of 4 adults requires approximately 8 liters of clean drinking water per day. One copper vessel running one overnight cycle produces 1 to 2 liters. 3 vessels. 3 jars, 3 copper strips, the total cost of approximately $2.10 in materials, cover a family of 4 completely. Running cost after that, nothing. No filter replacement, no monthly shipment, no asking anyone's permission to drink clean water. There is one condition where this works less well. Norse craftsmen who built and maintained copper vessels for long-distance trade routes knew it and accounted for it in their water protocols. That condition is the last thing in this script. The limitation is turbidity. Cloudy water carrying suspended sediment, silt, organic particles from flooding or runoff, reduces the effectiveness of the copper mechanism. The reason is physical, not chemical. Copper ions move from the metal surface into the water column and reach bacteria floating freely in that column. A bacterium that is physically lodged inside a particle of clay or organic matter is shielded from the copper ions by the particle itself. The ions cannot reach what they cannot contact. The 2012 Journal of Health, Population and Nutrition study noted measurably reduced effectiveness in turbid water compared to clear water tested under the same conditions. The Norse solution was 2-stage processing, not a single vessel shortcut. Turbid water drawn from a river or stream goes into a first vessel, any material, and sits undisturbed until the sediment drops to the bottom. This takes between 1 and 4 hours, depending on particle size. The clarified water from the upper portion is then carefully decanted into the copper vessel for the overnight cycle. Gravity first, then copper, both free, both requiring nothing except patience. If your source water is clear, municipal tap water, filtered well water, collected rainwater, the copper cycle operates at full effectiveness with no pre-settling needed. That is the honest limitation. One additional step, no additional cost, solves it completely. The Gokstad ship is still in Oslo. The copper vessels recovered from its hull are on display at the Viking skipshuset, inside the original wood of a ship that crossed the North Atlantic over 1100 years ago. The oligodynamic effect those vessels relied on every day of every open water passage still operates. Von Nagli's 1893 paper still describes the mechanism accurately. The EPA's measured safe range for copper in drinking water still accommodates overnight storage with room to spare. The physics still works. The copper is still copper. And what you built does the same thing. You may have come here because your water bill is rising and you wanted something permanent. You may have come because you suspected that a technology as old as the Bronze Age was probably still functional and probably being ignored for reasons that had nothing to do with effectiveness. It does not matter why you came. The copper does not ask. It works either way.